Well, the empty ones.
On the left or right? I just sat down and didn't even think about it. Gosh. All right. Good evening, everybody. How are you all doing? It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here this evening. So I thought we could jump right in. Just a couple of sort of prefatory notes at the beginning that I wanted to just alert you to. The first thing is just be aware that we are filming this event. And so at some point in the near future, there's going to be an audio/video recording of it that will go on the internet. So just be aware of that. If you've got an issue with that, I guess now's the time to leave. Otherwise, be ready for it. And if you could do us the favor of also sort of promoting that at a later date, we will be sure to follow up with it. And you can send that link to all of your friends and colleagues that you think might be interested in it. The second thing is you will see that there has arrived some snack foods, junk food. Feel free, that's for everybody, obviously. These things are always a little bit tight in terms of how we organize when you eat and how you eat. I think what we'd like for you to do is to feel free to eat at any point over the next couple hours. If you want to get some snacks now so that you don't sort of interrupt the flow later, that's totally cool. If you want to interrupt the flow later, that's also fine. Just try to do it as peacefully and quietly as possible, but do take advantage of the popcorn, chips, and other things that are bad for your health but good for your soul. And I think with that, I want to sort of formally kick things off. Again, thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's great to see so many faces and so many familiar faces. When we were planning this and when I was sort of thinking it through, one of my big fears was that we're in late April now, and usually it's quite beautiful out, and if you're ever in charge of designing a public event, you have to compete with the weather. But thankfully, because of human-engineered climate change, we are now in forever winter. So it's a lot easier to ensure that more people are going to come out to these things as opposed to enjoy the blissful weather outside. So I thank you for that as well. Welcome to Bodies and Borders, which is a lecture series that's co-sponsored by the Polis Project, Warscapes Magazine, and the Doctoral Students Council here at the CUNY Graduate Center. My name is Michael Busch. I'm the senior editor of Warscapes Magazine and a member of the Polis Project Collective. I do want to take a moment to also extend my gratitude to the DSC and especially to Hamad Sindi, sitting right at the front of the room, for his and their exceptional generosity throughout the planning and execution of this series, the logistical help, and also the moral support that they've extended. Without them, and especially without Hamad, none of this would have been possible. So thank you very much for all of the stuff that you've been doing on behalf of us. The Polis Project is a humanities collective of scholars, of artists, activists, whose practice aims chiefly at having an impact beyond the sphere of specialized discussions. And our interests focus largely around issues of violence, issues of occupation, post-colony, self-determination, and the future trajectories of war. So pretty light stuff. And by making public interventions and opening up a public space for debate and for dissent, our hope is to nurture a cultivated intellectual, artistic, and political resistance to a lot of the forces that are currently in operation in this world. And based on common ideals and a common commitment, we've come together to produce and publish research, commentary, and analysis on some of those issues that I've previously described: war, conflict, militarization, and the transformation of occupied spaces. And this kind of work takes on a number of different forms, such as essays that we've published online, teach-ins, exhibitions, podcasts, and lecture series, of which this is our second, and it's called Bodies and Borders. Just to give you a brief introduction, and I promise I will stop talking very shortly, the first decades of the 21st century have kind of run a familiar course of international emergencies akin to what we saw in the 20th century, although with a sort of a distinct flavor. Things like the Mediterranean refugee crisis, the advent of ISIS, the advent of Donald Trump and his rise to the American presidency, the intensifying environmental degradation that we're experiencing, new genocides, among other things, have each thrown the political tension between bodies on the one hand and borders on the other into high relief. And so these questions of movement, of responsibility, of protection and belonging are at the heart of a lot of the concerns that we're interested in and really drive the response to man-made and natural disasters. So this series, Bodies and Borders, comprises a semester-long series of conversations that are examining, hopefully, the interplay between bodies and borders and discussions of those two categories sort of in connection and separately, and through a variety of different contextual frameworks and media, including nationalism, environmental breakdown, war, and some of the issues that we're going to be speaking about tonight, namely the intersections of gender, economy, race, and public health. I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Solomon this evening. For many of you, she needs no introduction, but just very briefly, for those benighted souls who don't know her, she teaches sociology and international studies at the City College of New York, where she was formerly the interim director of international studies, and where she remains one of the most popular and influential people on campus at that institution, and for very good reason, and certainly one of my favorite people in the CUNY system. In addition to her academic scholarship and her teaching, Dr. Rodriguez Solomon keeps very, very busy. She's an activist, she's a birthing doula, and she is a Kundalini yoga instructor, among other things. There's really, really nobody better, I don't think, on issues of justice and reproductive health than Griselda. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Solomon. Thank you for So we've got a ton of stuff to cover tonight. We've got about 2 hours in which to do it. And so I think we're going to sort of just jump right in, if that's all right with you. And I thought we could start by sort of opening up the discussion using sort of current events. And I'm thinking specifically of two kind of high-profile or moderately high-profile incidents recently. The first was the death of Erica Gardner, daughter of Eric Gardner. And the second was the piece that came out, I think, in Vanity Fair about Serena Williams and kind of her experience and kind of the harrowing experience that she had giving birth and the immediate after effects. And I'm wondering if we could sort of use that as a lens through which to begin to talk about and have you sort of talk about the intersection, on the one hand, between so-called medical care and the effect of medical care on Black and brown bodies in the United States at the current moment.
Yes. So thank you, Michael. Thank you for facilitating this and the Doctoral Student Council here at the CUNY Grad Center. It's my pleasure, especially because I see my current students, I see a lot of former students, I see some friends, colleagues, and a lot of new faces. So I just want to honor the fact that I don't take this lightly and that I do this as a representative of a large body of people, especially women, that have been tirelessly fighting on the ground to advocate on the behalf of women, people that birth children. And yeah, I think, so who knows about the story with Serena Williams postpartum? Who does not know? Who doesn't know? So some people, so Serena Williams gave birth, I believe, December, late last year, and she had to have a C-section for whatever reason. And a few hours after she had her baby, she was complaining of what she felt were symptoms of an embolism or like a blood clot in her lungs. She knew that because this is a condition she had before, and she asked the medical staff to tend to her, and they ignored her a bit. And then when they finally tended to her, they gave her a very base level of care. Eventually, it got so bad that she pretty much was coughing so much that her C-section wound opened, and they had to send her back into the emergency room. And gratefully, it happened because when they opened her up, she had blood clots in her abdomen, right? And they rushed, they gave her the proper care, and now she has a traumatizing birth story like so many other Black women in the United States have, where gratefully her celebrity, in a sense, afforded her the privilege of being able to be tended to in a way that a lot of other women of color, Black women, don't have that level of privilege in the US. And I think that I mean, on one end, birth workers, we're grateful that that story was prominent in mainstream media, because now a lot of people are talking about it. And recently, there has been a New York Times Magazine article that was just published. Linda Villarosa, who is a City College professor of journalism, she published this very revealing, and I mean, I was rereading it on my way here, and I literally had to fight back tears because she goes down the list of all of the negative experiences that Black women have had birthing children in the US. And now because of the celebrity behind or in front of this phenomena, more people are paying attention to something that has existed for many decades and that women have tirelessly been working to expose, but that hasn't gotten the attention that it deserved until now. And now we're having a lot of conversations, so much so that yesterday was the last day of the first ever Black Maternal Health Week, which was hosted or created by Black Mamas Matter Alliance out of Atlanta and a host of other birthwork entities, those of color in particular, because I didn't know, this is the United Nations Minority Health Month, where they're exposing, or Minority Ethnic Health Month, it's just a problematic wording to highlight the fact that so-called ethnic minorities around the world suffer at the hands of callous or careless medical care facilities or systems. And the irony is that this collective was like, instead of just focusing this lens around the world, which is very important, we need to shift the scope of the lens a bit and see what's happening to Black women in the US. And there were talks, there were film screenings, and this event, it just happened to take place around the time of Black Maternal Health Week, because this is critical. This is critical, the fact that in 2018, in the 21st century, in an industrialized country like the US, Black babies and Black women have a higher risk of dying while giving birth and after birth than white women, so much so that this New York Times Magazine article states that the gap, the racial disparity between white women and Black women today in the US has not been matched since 1850. So we're talking about over 100 and what's that, 60 years, that it's been 116 years since white women and Black women fared so differently. And we're not even talking about just poor Black women. There's tons of studies that have come out to say that when you control for class, even high income women with high degrees of education fare worse. There's some, and I'm going to be throwing out a lot of, I also want to make sure to preface that this is a safe space. So if you respond or react in a certain way, please feel free, if you need to interrupt me, to raise your hand or ask for what you need, because these are very dire statistics that as people, but specifically those that are marginalized, we embody on a daily basis, and to hear it incessantly without necessarily processing could have an effect. So I'm just going to throw out like these statistics, but the purpose of this conversation is to demonstrate what we are doing on the ground to address these issues. And it's just alarming that in the 21st century, a woman that chooses to have a birth in a hospital has to contend with the reality that she may not be treated like a full human being. Who has had children in the room? Who has seen children come to life? Can I see, are there any doulas in the house? Doulas, a few of us training. And I ask because we live in a culture, and my students know that I reiterate this over and over, where the indoctrination to abide by these notions of a capitalist mode of being, it really reduces us to binary ways of looking at the world, and we're led to behave. Even this setup, I mean, I appreciate it because it's neat, but this setup where we're here talking at you is very much in line with this thinking that there's people that have power and there's people that don't have power. There's people that know and there's people that don't know. So when you're in the presence of a person, of a woman who's birthing a child naturally, you get to see what a human being looks like in a raw state, right? You get to see, especially a woman, what we look like when we don't have to behave anymore, when we don't have to take up space anymore, when we don't have to worry about messing up our hair or saying things or our body parts showing. And to me, that is such a rewarding experience. And to think that that experience of living or being your most human self is stifled at such a delicate moment in life, I'm only wondering what's going to happen to the children that come into the world under these experiences that can be pretty violent. So today's conversation, I'm going to share my experiences as a doula, but also as an academic who has studied this incessantly, because I think, and like other birth activists believe, this is a human rights issue, not just around the world, but in the United States, where we often look to the continent of Africa, like, oh, those poor women. And yes, we have to consider that, because of structural forms of poverty, impoverished women in rural areas of like sub-Saharan Africa have certain experiences, or South Asia or parts of Latin America have experiences that most women in the US don't experience, because we have potable water and we have technology. But yet, and still, when you look at the statistics in the industrialized world, women in the US are dying at an exorbitant rate. So much so that, like, I was telling my students, there's this wonderful article that came out, a report, Deli Delivery, Amnesty International created this report in 2010. And in it, they relay the fact that there's a statistic where, with regards to maternal and infant mortality in the US, we are on par with, like, I think it's Malawi, right? On the continent of Africa. And that's shameful for the US. The racist implications of that we can unpack all night, but to think that we consider ourselves to be the cream of the crop and the most industrialized country in the world, and yet we're not treating the people that are birthing the human beings to further this nation the way that they should be treated.
That's lots to unpack.
I know it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's good. And we're gonna try to do that over the course of this conversation. I want to start, I think, by sort of highlighting one of the issues that you bring up, and it's central to all of this, right? Which is this notion of justice. Mm-hmm. And the title of this event is Birthing sort of Injustice and Justice. And I want you to begin, if you would, just sort of talking a little bit about what that means. Where does this concept come from? How does it operate as a theory? And sort of how is it given life as a practice or not?
Yes. So birthing justice it's a movement, it's a framework, it's a lens, it's a way of looking at maternity care in the US from a racialized perspective. What does that mean? When we use a birthing justice lens, right, or frame, like we've been discussing in the transnational feminism class, it allows us to look at a dynamic like maternal health in the US in new ways, and it really brings out the fact that racism underlines a lot of the experiences of women of color, Black women in the US. Birthing justice was birthed out of a collective of women of color, African American women in particular, in around the late 70s, early 80s, because they felt like they did not see themselves in the larger reproductive justice, pro-choice movement that had been emerging with the second wave of feminism in the late 60s, right? Most of us know Roe versus Wade, the right to choose to have an abortion, monumental manifestations of the ability to exercise our right to use our bodies the way we want as women, but leaving out a very central aspect of this idea of choice, right? Where the assumption of the pro-choice movement, or the legalization of abortion, assumes that everybody has the same right to choose, right? The idea that like everybody has the same choices, and in the 21st century we understand that that's not the case. But most importantly, what the birthing justice movement in a sense was clapped back, or was rhetorically asking of this budding movement for the right to choose to have an abortion is like, but what happens to people that want to have babies? What happens to the people that choose to carry life? What are we doing to ensure that they're not only carrying, but they're birthing and they're raising children in sane and humane environments? And that's where birth justice stepped in and started to create experiences, ideas, movement collectives where this idea of tending to a woman or a person's right to carry and birth a baby in a humane way. And ever since then, I call it a movement. It's been spearheaded and it's been sustained by women of color, African American women in particular, who understand that the state is not necessarily doing what it needs to do to protect women or birthing people, and they're stepping in to take the place of the state. Also, birth justice emerged because there was a recognition that birth became a very lucrative venture. For those that don't know, birth or hospitalization related to maternity care is one of the most profitable or the most expensive branches of healthcare in the USA. I mean, the statistic is like in 2010, obstetrics care generated $111 billion. $111 billion. So we're asking, how are we spending so much money on maternity care, but women or people who are birthing babies are not, in a sense, getting a quality product in return? And this is what birth justice tries to address.
And can you talk a little bit about what it looks like in practice? Like, what are the interventions? How do they sort of take shape or take form?
Allopathic, which is our traditional Western medical model, is present day very hands-on with birth. And there's a bunch of technologies, a bunch of medicine, a lot of pharmaceutical products that are presented to people to enhance birth, to expedite birth, to reduce pain or discomfort. But what we find as doulas, and particularly Black doulas of color, is that those increased forms of intervention actually get in the way of physiological birth. So this is why we're seeing New York City has one of the highest C-section rates in the country, right? I don't know, birth workers in the house is like, it was 33% last time I checked. The World Health Organization deems that for a nation to be able to prosper and for the people of the nation to feel like they matter, it should be down at 15%. So we're asking, where the hell is the disconnect? If this governing body that is the watchdog of health in the world, the World Health Organization that sets standards for how people should be treated within a medical care model, is saying that you should keep the number to 15%, why does New York have such a high percentage of C-sections? And those are the things that we try to address as birth workers within the birth justice movement.
Yeah, and this sort of highlights, I think, something that we can pivot to a little bit, and that is kind of the economic dimension of this, because it strikes me that you can make the argument that medical care with respect to reproductive health and the birthing process sort of involves two different sort of categories, right? On the one hand, you bring up this idea of all the money that's just involved in medicine and hospitals, specifically related to maternal care, and that seems like a very specific form of wealth accumulation. But on the other hand, you can think about sort of the wealth accumulation that happens on the other side, historically, on the backs of Black and brown bodies. And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about both of those things, give maybe a little bit of an historical overview of the evolution of how wealth accumulation has become kind of inextricably tied with the body, and specifically, in this country, since that's where a lot of the focus is tonight.
Yes, so it has a lot to do with witches, right? My students here know that I take them on a journey where we start with the witch hunts of 13th century medieval Europe. And I know some people here are like, what? But yes, you have to go back to look at the Inquisition in particular to understand why women are treated the way that they are today in a culture of misogyny, but specifically in maternal care. And it's fascinating. For those that are interested in my class, Federici is giving a talk here next Friday. Is it next Friday?
Yeah, with Juan Gonzalez.
Yes. So I don't know if that's going to be extra credit, but we're reading Silvia Federici. She's a Italian feminist. She wrote this amazing book called Caliban and the Witch. She's a socialist feminist, so it's a dense book that takes time to get through, but she's unpacking a lot because she's making the connection between the witch hunts and the advent of capitalism. Her argument is that capitalism in 13th, 14th, 15th century Western Europe could not have developed if women, especially powerful women, were not put in place, were not checked. So when you look at the records of the witch hunts that spanned over 400 years, the people that were mostly targeted were the organizers of a village, the people that gathered people to say, we're not going to let you mercantilists come and with your new money try to privatize our land that we use as a community to grow our own food and celebrate these earth traditions and our pagan rituals. And it was those people, but women in particularly, that were targeted. Other targets of the witch hunts were midwives, herbalists, people that had a level of power to heal communities, whereas the community didn't have to rely on the state for their care. So they understood that to really get at the root of collective movements against capitalism, they had to really, in a sense, destroy the feminine power that existed, because it wasn't just about women. We know that men and women and those who identify, along the spectrum of gender, we can embody feminine and masculine energy. So it was also men that embodied a lot of the feminine qualities that allowed for a very multidimensional perspective of the world. Fast forward, and we know, for those that are in my class, we speak about this tirelessly, the atrocious things that were done to people, but to women very publicly, to really set an example and psychologically, like we spoke about in Global Perspectives yesterday, discipline the public in a way where you understood that if you behaved like these people behaved, this was going to be your punishment, and that terror was internalized and passed on throughout the generations. Fast forward, the conquest, 1492, Columbus, sailed the ocean blue, developed this system that we are still living under today. And what Federici, myself, and others understand is that the mechanisms of control that were, in a sense, experimented on the backs of women, the witches of Western Europe, they were fine-tuned on the backs of indigenous and African people on this side of the world. And specifically, that form of corporal terror was enhanced or enforced via people's wombs. What do I mean by that? Indigenous women were sexually assaulted publicly, and they were deemed to not reproduce because Europeans at the time wanted their land. So that's one way that wombs of color were, in a sense, controlled by the state. For African women, enslaved African women, we were forced to produce people so that these people could populate the systems of plantation and gold mining, if you will, like in countries like present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti and South America. So in a sense, it was forced reproduction, to the point where my understanding and others is that as women of African descent and women of indigenous descent, and even European women, because they too were forced to produce bodies for the capitalist machine, that trauma is still lodged in our energy bodies, right? My Kundalini yoga training allows me to recognize that trauma just doesn't live in the present, but we inherit a lot of our trauma, especially people with wombs. We inherit a specific type of trauma because we have a space in our body that holds that trauma. So it's a very intense way of saying that historical trajectory is why today a woman in her most primal and powerful state, which is when she's giving natural birth, has to be tamed. She has to be tamed so that this machine could reproduce itself.
Mm-hmm. And you speak about this trauma, and I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack the ways in which this trauma, residual and current, this sort of maybe some of the environmental factors that play upon women, and specifically women of color, sort of affect their health, and specifically their maternal health.
I mean, there's a lot of newer research coming out, especially in this field of epigenetics, which is the idea that our genes can morph depending on our environment, and not just physical environment, but also psychologically. So now, before, let's say 30 years ago, these racial disparities existed, and people were baffled, like, why on earth are Black women dying at higher rates than white women? Black women, we understand it's because of racism. Other people looking in couldn't believe it. Like, it cannot possibly be that in an industrialized nation like the US, women of color are dying or experiencing traumatic experiences during birth because of racism. Fast forward, and there's a lot of now psychological, epidemiological research coming out to show that our genes actually wear down throughout our life if we consistently experience forms of neglect because of the way we're gendered, because of the color of our skin, because of our sexual preferences, and because of the history of slavery and dehumanization of people of African descent on this side of the world. Our specific predisposition to carry stress in our body is much more profound than white people. Listen to me, and we have to be careful, because for the birth workers that know, Ina Mae Gaskin she still is like crunchy granola grandmama of like the natural birth movement in the US. She was ripped apart last year because in a dialogue about birth injustice, they asked her to address racial disparities. And in a sense, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we don't know what her intentions were, but she pretty much spoke in a way where she was blaming Black women to say, where their bodies are just a bit deficient, and that's why they can't carry babies the way that white women do. So we also have to be careful with this epigenetics argument, because yes, women of African descent, we are prone to higher forms of stress, but even if we weren't, we enter into a system that is already looking at us as not fully human. So even if we were vibrant and healthy, just like our white counterparts, when we are rolled in or enter into a hospital room, we are already being treated differently because of the implicit biases that people internalize about marginalized others.
Yeah, and that's the Serena Williams, right?
Yes.
And that was what was so shocking, is here's a person, a woman of color, of great means, and still at the exact same time experiences all of these deficiencies of care that white women are simply not subject to. Switching gears just a little bit to the question of interventions and the role of the doula, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about how, well, there's a lot of things I want to talk about here, but sort of how doulas interact with the kind of the hyper-medicalized system of maternal care and birthing, and to the extent possible, sort of talk about maybe to the degree to which there's kind of stigma attached to that, and how that sort of plays out in the experience of women when they're giving birth.
Who's a doula here again? So y'all know that we fight.
Yes.
Doulas of color, Black doulas, we fight. And I even get chills. We fight. What do I mean? When I went into doula training in 2012, gratefully, I trained with Ancient Song Doula Services, which is a Brooklyn-based social justice organization. So we weren't just learning about lavender oil and counter pressure and all those things that are very important, right, to birth, especially natural birth. We were also learning about the intersectional forms of oppression that dictate that if you are woman, if you're Black, if you're queer, if you're immigrant, all these factors intersect and play into your experiences while birthing. So yes, those that are doulas here, our doula bag is filled with a bunch of essential oils, tennis balls, heat packs, but we also, arm ourselves with a form of resistance that's very carefully manifested, because if we are too assertive, we could get kicked out of the room. What does it look like? A person has been in labor for 20 hours. You have to dilate from 0 to 10. 10 or 9, you can push a baby out. We are on the clock because the capitalist system of profit says that you want to increase profits and decrease cost, so you want that bed to be emptied soon. They put a time on it, which is like, how can you put a time on something that's so spontaneous? It's been 20 hours, she hasn't dilated. They're like, we want to rupture your membrane. Mm-hmm. This person has no idea about what that means. I offer her a layperson's translation. They're going to insert this thing that looks like a knitting thread. They're going to insert it into your cervix. It has a hook. They're going to hook it into the amniotic sac. They're going to pop it. The amniotic fluid is going to come out. They're going to break your water, and that's going to increase your contractions like over the top. And then I asked the medical staff, can the family have 2 minutes to talk? And doulas in the house, what usually happens when that happens?
They sub 13.
They suck their teeth. They say no. They say that it needs to be done right now. So it's a constant battle. They're the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which is like the governing body of obstetrics care and gynecology in the US, has said that there's been proven research that a person can eat while birthing. Standard practice here is that if the minute you go into labor and they put an IV into your arm, you cannot eat. You can only chew ice, because they're afraid that if, of course, everything is looked at in a surgical perspective, they fear that if eventually you end up getting a C-section, you might like throw up and choke on like your vomit, being very crass. But ACOG has come out and said they have to eat. They can't eat, they have to eat, because giving birth is like running a marathon. But even today in 2018, there's still a lot of hospitals that are like, no, what? Can you imagine for 20 hours, 30 hours sometimes, no water, no juice, nothing, just ice. So what do doulas do? What do we do?
Honey sticks.
We sneak in food. So these are all subversive forms of like ensuring that the person is as comfortable as possible. But we are like this little person throwing these like stones at this gigantic mountain. Thankfully, there's a lot of us now throwing enough stones that people are now like, what's going on? But sometimes it does feel like an uphill battle.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit, I'm ignorant about this entirely, so I'm curious, when it comes to healthcare insurance, what is and what is not covered with respect to the work of the doula during the birthing process?
Doulas, till this day, we are not formally covered by any form of insurance. There are like some state mandated programs through Medicaid that they'll reimburse a doula, but oftentimes it takes a long time. You can have a birth in January and you won't get paid like in the summer, maybe June, July. And for like the 4 to 7 months of care that you afforded this person, you get like $500, right? So being a doula is not sustainable. Most doulas have like a bunch of side hustles. And then we also have to talk about like the industry of doula care and the way that race plays into that. Having a doula has become this thing where it's perceived to be something that only white wealthy women can afford, because doulas in New York charge on average $2,500 to $3,000. And honestly, I'm gonna say that is a just rate when you consider the fact that you are working with this person for sometimes 6 months. My husband's here. He knows that I leave to a labor and I could be gone for 12 hours and I could be gone for 2 days. And then once the person comes home, we provide very minimal but some standard of postpartum care. So what doulas of color we're doing, not only are we not able to charge that amount of money because most of our clients can't afford it, but also it's ironic how we don't get compensated as much, but we do twice as much the work, because we know that the fact that our clients are mostly working class, middle class women of color, there's implications of the type of fight that's going to have to take place. And quite honestly, if it wasn't because we are passionate about it, it's an extremely exhausting craft. Not only physically, where I'm often awake sometimes for 2 days, but emotionally, I think I have cried at almost every birth, out of sheer joy, but mostly out of sheer frustration. I mean, again, my husband knows I have called him like at 2 a.m, like, I am so upset. She got an epidural. But that emotional labor, it doesn't play into like the amount of compensation that we get. Even for a home birth, women that choose to have a home birth, people that choose to have a home birth with their insurance, it's a lot of work to get your insurance to cover a home birth midwife. Like in my case, I had a home birth. It wasn't a lot of work, thank God, compared to other people, because I had private insurance at the time. But it took a lot of phone calls and a lot of convincing, because they were trying to say, well, why do you want her when you have all of these options in your area? And I had to write a letter, and I had to the point where my baby was born in August, and the midwife didn't get paid until probably like February. So 6 months after the baby was born, she got paid.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit about, you've sort of highlighted the differences from kind of a structural perspective between sort of hospital births or traditional hospital births and traditional sort of doula-induced births. or not induced, that's the wrong word, but assisted births. But can you talk a little bit about what the outcomes look like, the difference between sort of the hyper-medicalized American outcome and sort of the process that you're advocating and practicing in your work?
I mean, as you all can imagine, natural home births or birthing with a midwife has statistics that are in a sense much more positive than if you birth in a traditional hospital setting. Less C-sections, less stillbirths, less maternal mortality, or what we consider near deaths. A midwifery model looks at at birth holistically to say, how is the person mentally, how are they emotionally, how are they physically, do you feel safe, do you feel comfortable? A lot of times when you birth with a midwife, there's like psychotherapy options for you to engage in. There is a quality of care that you don't find in allopathic medicine. Allopathic medicine, again, taking intention aside, the statistics are dire. More women have C-sections, more women are dying, more people are experiencing what you know, in the birth worker field we know as obstetrics violence. They're being violated under, you know, obstetrics violence in a way that you can be spared if you choose to birth with a midwife. I don't advocate for natural birth for everybody because, a lot of people are high risk or you have some conditions that may play into the experience when you give birth. But anybody in the house who's thinking of having a child or knows somebody that does, and you're low risk and you are healthy and you have, a sane perspective of yourself and you feel like you can empower yourself and be empowered by your community, I would highly recommend birthing with a midwife, and most specifically birthing with a midwife at home, especially if you are a Black woman, if you're a woman of color, if you're an immigrant, if you're queer, if you're trans, because all of these, identities have been deemed to experience birth in a way that's not necessarily empowering in a hospital.
So what should be done about birthing justice? We can talk about this in a number of different ways, but kick it off with sort of like a policy level discussion. What needs to happen?
I think first we need to look at medical schools. We need to really have like committees reviewing textbooks, reviewing curriculum to see what is it that doctors are learning in medical school that allows them to exit and behave in ways that are just so dehumanizing. Doulas know a win for us is if a doctor walks in the room and says, good morning, good afternoon. I'm like, in my heart, I'm like, oh, this is a good one. And I'm like, base, that's bottom line. The fact that this person acknowledged the people in the room. So I'm interested in knowing, what do medical students learn? What do they learn? Another thing is having, I know this may sound but having more health ed classes in high school that are realistic, not like don't have sex, but just really presenting people with options about sex and sexuality that are realistic. And also my dream, which I've started doing already, is engaging with young people, young women in particular, at a very early age to expose them to this information so that it's a seed in their mind. And when they're ready to have children, they have a sense of empowerment that puts them ahead of those that may not necessarily have that level of information.
Perfect. I want to take a moment to try to open the conversation up because it's just been you and I. So at this moment, I think what we should do is just sort of speak your question. We'll try to keep it as kind of informal and flowing as possible. If there's cacophony, then I'll start orchestrating, but why don't you kick it off and then from there just jump in.
My question is, I'm trying to understand what is the difference between a doula and a midwife. Okay. And my second thing is introducing Black women to really good sound nutrition.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would be also a start to address this injustice kind of thing. But the first question I'd like to know, what is the difference between midwifing, which really started a lot in the South, in the old South, with African Americans. And there was no problem. Those babies were healthy.
Yes.
And a midwife and a doula.
Yes. So thank you for that question. And yes, if you haven't read the article Linda Villarosa, she just wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine, and she talks about, I mean, she's one of many where in the segregated South, when Black women were tending to births, Black babies were not dying at the rates that they are now. So we're talking about antebellum, Jim Crow South, this idea that like then Black babies must have been dying, and no, that was not the case. That was not the case. So that's a conundrum, right? The difference between a doula and a midwife is that a midwife is a highly trained professional that has gone through rigorous years of training, of schooling. A lot of them are nurses, certified nurses, sometimes nurse practitioners, and they, in a sense, are, in my mind, they're doctors. They're doctors, right? They do everything from prenatal care to the birth to newborn care. They are highly skilled, highly trained, badasses. A doula, we're not a midwife's assistant because that's a technical term. They are midwife's assistant. We are companions. We walk with the person who's about to have a baby as a consistent companion to offer a very specific type of care that is afforded to us because of our training. Doulas, I trained for 8 weeks. Sometimes doulas train for 5 months. Sometimes they do it for a weekend intensive, but the training is very minimal compared to a midwife. I'm not a doctor. I always say this, doulas, we tend to the person from the waist up. A midwife tends to the person from the waist down. I don't touch the baby. I don't carry it. I don't do anything. I don't check the woman. I just offer the person a lot of encouragement. I have a bag of tricks that I know psychologically and also physically help to reduce the sensations of discomfort that may come up. And then I provide a bunch of information about options that will help the person feel empowered during the birthing process. And nutrition, yes, nutrition. So when I chose to have a home birth, I went with a home birth midwife who was also a nutritionist. And I would see her, every time I went to get prenatal care, I would see her and she would give me supplements, and I had to keep a food journal because what we're doing as communities of color is that we're also trying to empower ourselves from the bottom up. Instead of waiting for the state to finally come down and offer their support, which they're doing slowly but surely, like in East Brooklyn, Bronzeville, Bed-Stuy, Flatbush, East New York, there are lactation centers, right? Where now people that are breastfeeding or want to pump, they can go into like any space that these little pods they have. And as somebody who breastfed for 2 years, I couldn't understand how difficult it was to find a safe place to pump. And those that don't know, if your body produces milk and your breasts fill up, and if you don't pump within a certain time frame, your breasts get extremely hard, and you could get mastitis, meaning like your glands get clogged and you can get an extreme headache. So I was always on a schedule. My students that were around right after the baby was born knew that like Dr. G had a time, 30 minutes that you couldn't bother her. Her door was closed because I was pumping. But when I was out in the street, I would go to ask for a space to pump and people would be like, oh, pump in the bathroom. I'm like, that's like asking somebody to go eat in the bathroom. So the state is doing a little bit of addressing these issues, but as communities of color, marginalized communities, we're doing the work from the bottom up.
Before you mentioned that this year was the first week of Black Maternal Health Week.
Yes.
How did Black Mamas Matter go about establishing that or getting that into the public eye?
I mean, the details of that I don't really know because I'm not part of the collective. What I do know is that they use the fact that the United Nations has deemed this the month where awareness about the health disparities based on ethnic and now racial dynamics. The fact that the UN has dictated that this is a month where they're going to increase that awareness, the Black Mamas Matter Alliance chose to kind of ride that wave and say, well, since we're talking about this, let's use this platform to increase awareness on the fact that Black women in the U.S. experience birth and postpartum in certain ways. But it's beautiful. They orchestrated it, but it's a bunch of collectives all over the countries. I attended a screening of a wonderful documentary. If anybody's interested, it's called Death by Delivery. It's produced by Fusion. They screened the film and then they had a panel of like different experts. Black Mamas Matter, if you want to look them up, they have a toolkit readings, of discussions, of talking points that they encourage people to host like roundtables or informal dialogues in their respective states. So it just feels like this is the beginning of something very big with regards to Black maternal health. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this informative talk. I was actually at the screening, so it's fusion.org. I think that's where you can get the documentary if you're interested in watching it further. So I have, my thing is, because you mentioned the med schools, and then that there needs to be like a retraining in terms of curriculum, or even just how certain doctors approach women in terms of, during their birthing experience. Because it's not all doctors we know, but like just those experiences we hear, it just makes you like want to cringe. But my question is, but what about the hospitals already, where like there's this whole culture of people not treating women like human beings? For example, because I'm not sure we were at the same screening. This was at the Ancient English Home Services. Was it last week? So there was a woman, I think she was pregnant. She mentioned something about if people asked her what hospitals would they go to, for these type of services, she said she wouldn't recommend any hospital in the Bronx at all.
Yeah.
And that to me was shocking. Like, I don't live in the Bronx, so I can't relate. But like, what do you think like restructuring hospital systems would look like?
Oh my God, yes. So there's a whole culture in New York City about, as doulas, what hospitals to stay away from. And sadly, when you look at it, it's a no-brainer. Most of the hospitals that, as doulas, we're like, stay that other way. They're in communities of color. They're in working class communities. This is a multifaceted beast that we are up against, right? So it's about retraining doctors, retraining medical personnel, medical professionals. But it's also, my students know, my family just lost one of my family members to mesothelioma. She was 57 years old. And as first-generation immigrant who speaks fluent English and knows how to navigate the system, my twin sister and I took we kind of spearheaded her care after she agreed to be put on this experimental vaccine that just took her from 0 to 100 with regards to degenerating her health. And even with, it's not just maternal health. This is about healthcare in general. The form of benign neglect that's felt across the board, whether you're Black, you're white, you're a woman, you're queer, you're an immigrant, you speak English, but especially if you embody otherness, like my students know what that means. Visibly, you embody otherness, your quality of care is gonna diminish substantially. And the doulas in the house know, and even my students express that they too are like cultural brokers for their family. It's a constant fight. Case in point, my mother had an appointment with her cardiologist because in December, her blood pressure just wouldn't go down. And it was because they had prescribed her this new diabetes medication that was not regulating her blood pressure. We went to see the doctor and he's like, okay, let's just change the medication. See me in 3 months, 4 months. I couldn't go with her to the appointment, but I told her, Ma, call me because she doesn't speak English so that I can be on speakerphone. This is the follow-up to see how the medication is working with my mother's system. And I asked, my mother waited an hour and 20 minutes. Her appointment was at 11. She called me at 12:15, 12:20. And I'm just like, oh, how she's doing? She's fine. Her blood pressure, oh, the medications. And well, he says something like, this medication is not working, so we're giving her this. I said, can you tell me the list of medications? I just asked the cardiology, the heart-related medication that he's going to give my mom. My mother was in his room for 2 minutes and he's like, he was frustrated. He's like, I have a list. I have a whole line of patients outside. I don't have time for this. So fire-breathing dragon wanted to come out and I had to take a deep breath and I had to say, I'm really thankful for your time, but this is a follow-up for a very important, appointment that my mother had, and I would really appreciate it. And then he's like, oh, of course. And then not only did he give me the cardiology medicine, he gave me all her medication. But it took advocacy that as an immigrant Black Dominican woman, my mother does not understand. My mother puts a lot of our folks here, you know, in your family, she puts blind trust in doctors. And I'd be like, Ma, chill. Like, you need to, like, understand that the most well-meaning person is operating within a structure that can't see you as a full human being. My mother is a 74-year-old, like, immigrant woman. Like, it just be like this with her. But gratefully, my sister and I are there to advocate for her. But I always wonder, what about people that don't have advocacy? I can only imagine. You know, something as simple as like closing the door to a labor and delivery room. Closing a door, doulas know, that is like a point of contestation in a delivery room. You can't close the door. Why? I mean, I know that for some people it just seems so simple, but I look at it microscopically to understand it macroscopically. It's a power struggle. And when you look at most of the nurses that are attending to these birthing people, they are often women of color, immigrant women of color, right? Because the U.S. has a nice system where they go to the Philippines, and now they go to like countries like Haiti to offer nurses in those countries visas. Why? So that they can pay them less than a nurse here in the U.S. So they're overworked, they're underpaid, and they're frustrated. And here comes Gris wanting to know the names of all the medication, and they just roll their eyes at me way back. And I'm like, okay. Right, but it's those little things that really lead to a cascade of energy that doesn't allow for everybody to have the same experience while giving birth. Yes. Hi, Andrea.
Hi. It's been like 4 years. I wanted to know what your experience is with the support of a woman's spouse and like introducing them to all of this, because I feel like once I'm ready to have a baby and be able to explain this to my spouse, like I want a doula or I want a midwife, I'm gonna have all these voices like, what are you doing? There's a doctor and they know better. So I know it's all about empowering women, like I make my own decisions, but I'm also very, I want his support. So
I mean, it's a mixed bag, but in a like heteronormative context, when it's like a man and a woman, it tends to be a struggle. It tends to be a struggle because patriarchy, right? A man is taught that like you are in control, you have the final say, and when a person decides that they want to take the control of their birthing experience in their hands, it really brings up a lot of shit in the couple. Where I'll be asking you, how do you feel about an epidural? And the man will be like, oh, she's getting one. You know, and I have to bite my tongue because I'm like, okay. It's funny, like, again, as a doula, you become a marriage counselor, you become a social worker, you become so many things. But it's good that you're having this conversation now. I mean, my husband's here. I don't know if you want to address that, because I know you always are just like, these brothers have to chill. This is my husband, y'all.
Yeah, I feel like I was just gonna be the best support system I could be for Griselda. And you know, there were times when you know, she presented a home birth. I said, all right, that's what you want? All right, cool. He said, oh, maybe I want to go to a birthing center. You want to go to a birthing center? All right, cool. Maybe I go to the hospital. You really want to go to the hospital? You sure?
That was me when I was pregnant, like, yeah.
But for me, it was, you know, I realized, it was just common sense that it's not my body. You know, I'm not doing any of the work. I'm not carrying the baby. I'm not feeling any of the sensations that, you know, her body is feeling for those 9-10 months. And I'm not going to be the one pushing this baby out or being cut open and having the baby removed, whatever happens, right? So, you know, it's her decision, you know, and I just wanted to be as supportive as I can. So I basically just took a back seat and did what I was told, and that was it.
Literally, and for our home birth, it was myself, it was my twin sister, it was my best friend and the baby's godmother, it was the doula that we hired, it was like my spiritual godmother, and it was the midwife. 6 women and him.
Yeah.
And I always tell the story about the importance, right? Being a doula is not just about all these things we'll be discussing. I feel like I'm also holding space for something that was so common to all people in the past, right? We're talking about the proverbial past, like I like the way you all as students like to write, a very long time ago, since the beginning of time. I'll be like, oh, okay. Wow. But yes, since we have a consciousness as human beings, women-centered spaces were very common. And women gave birth with other women around. That because it's like if you are birthing a baby and your mother birthed the baby and your grandmother birthed the baby, you want them in the room because they can tell you what to do. It wasn't until capitalism and like turn of the specifically 19th century that men started to come in hardcore and take the place of midwives, because there was this idea with the ideology of capitalism that man is centered to existence, so man must be centered to all things, right? So as a doula, we take the place of the aunties and the grandmas and the sisters, so much so that during our birth, my birth was relatively short. I was in active labor for 9 hours. For some people, it's like, that's a lot of time, but considering a first-time birth, it was pretty quick. And within the 9 hours, I don't remember a lot because I went somewhere, I don't know where I went, but I'm happy I did go there because I was able to birth my child very powerfully. But I always felt supported. And then the doula suggested, how about you all go into the room and you bond, or I don't know. I just kept coming in and out. And I just remember that I was screaming, right? When the other women in the space were not around, the sensations of the contractions felt like they were gonna take over. And then when the women came into the room and started to like assure me, that's when I felt like I could cope with the sensations. And that's powerful. Not saying that he couldn't hold space, but he was one person. And I know that I'm gonna maybe upset some people, but he was a man, right? He doesn't have a womb. So even if you don't have a child, you can still like, in a sense, empathize with me in a way that like a man can't. And this is the power that has been stripped from us as women, as people with wombs, a power that is very primal and that is very necessary. There's this great book called Immaculate Deception. This really like, again, love them to death, crunchy granola, old white woman that is just like, this is a conspiracy to zap women of like our primal energy when the allopathic medicine tries to take over at birth. Yeah, it's literally like taking our ability to tap into, think about it. When was the last time as women, the women in the room, those identified as women in the room, when was the last time you were able to just be like tap into the mammalian, reptilian brain and really be like your animal self? When was the last time? You were on all fours like, which is how most people get when they're in natural labor. So think about the power that is available to you when you allow yourself to go to that place. I went to that place and I found parts of myself that I was like, whoa, I like that. I'm so serious. And most women that give birth naturally, and I'm careful with this because I know that there are circumstances that don't allow all people to have natural vaginal birth, especially home birth. But most women, Black women in particular, will say that shit changed my life. Birthing my baby natural, birthing my baby at home, birthing my baby the way that I wanted. And those that knew me before I had a baby and those that know me after know that I am not the same person. I mean, most people that have babies are not, but the fact that I chose to do it the way that I did, whenever stuff gets rough, I'd be like, girl, what are you doing? You did that. And I go to my phone and I look at my picture of myself in my tub, in the inflatable tub that was filled up in the kitchen of our apartment in Ridgewood, Queens. And I dead ass look at that picture and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, we did that. Yeah, keep it moving. And that's a psychological form of empowerment that is being stripped from us. Because to me, it's just too much power. It's too much power for women to have, too much power for Black women to have. And again, this book, Immaculate Deception, was one of the first times that I actually saw what I had been feeling as a doula in print. Like, oh, so I'm not this conspiracy theorist that lives in the cloud. There's other women and people that have felt that there has to be something with regards to why women are so controlled when we're giving birth. And let's not talk about the placenta. There's this obsession with the placenta in allopathic care. For those that don't know, you can ingest your placenta. right? And you can either chop it up and put it in a smoothie, or you can dehydrate it, encapsulate it, and drink it as pills. The benefits is that it increases milk production, it decreases postpartum depression because it regulates hormonal activity in the brain. The FDA hasn't approved it, and there's no pharma-sponsored research to confirm the anecdotal research that exists about women that say that, yes, that ingesting my placenta helped. But there's still this this power struggle where, as a doula, when I'm working with a client that wants to keep her placenta, it's this thing, like either they look at you like you're this animal that's gonna go into a corner and just eat the placenta, or there's there's a lot of, again, speculation about what happens to medical waste. What happens to medical waste that belongs to marginalized people? There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of things that as folks of color, we speculate. Like, why is this obsession with keeping our body parts? I know this elder friend of mine, this indigenous Mexican woman, she's Yaqui, and she went to the Middle East to fight in Afghanistan, came back and had to have a hysterectomy because of all the stress that was induced on her body, being an indigenous woman, a Latina, and then being deployed on the ground in war. And she said that she had to fight for months because as an indigenous woman, the placenta, but especially when your reproductive organs are taken out, you bury them to honor like Mother Earth for the, childbearing or, reproductive energies that you've been blessed with. She had to fight the state for almost 5 months to be granted access to her womb, right? And it's like, why? That belongs to you. These are our body parts. So I feel like there could be a whole lecture about the placenta and the obsession in allopathic medicine with keeping our body parts. And we know, again, throughout history, the many experiments that have been done on, folks of color. There was this monumental ruling just happened yesterday. Does anybody know where that Marion Sims statue is?
Mm-hmm. It's
where?
In the cemetery now in Brooklyn. Like, where was it before?
Where was it before?
In front of the New York College of Medicine.
Where?
In Central Park.
Mm-hmm. So there's a statue of this white man that's considered to be the father of gynecology, Marion Sims, but he's also known for experimenting on enslaved African women. So a lot of the wonderful tools that we have as people with wombs within gynecology, from like a pap smear to hysterectomies, they were finessed on the wombs and the backs of African women without anesthesia. Sometimes he would open and sew women up like 4 or 5 times. And there was, within the context of Black Maternal Health Week, there was a collective of birth advocates of color that petitioned for the city council to remove the statue, and it's going to be removed. So those are symbolic forms of addressing these issues that I think are happening slowly but surely. I went to Syracuse University, and ironically, the African American Studies Department was in the building in Sims Hall. It was named after Marion Sims. So the psychology of that is really interesting. And now I just learned, I went a few weeks ago to give a talk on reproductive injustice. The Women and Gender Studies Department has been moved to Sims. So I don't know what the people are doing, if they're gonna, petition, rally to get the building's name changed. But it was ironic that all the buildings on SU campus, the Black students and faculty were in this building that was named after this man that had no remorse for people of color. You can't make this up.
There's a book called Birthing a Slave that's actually really good.
Birthing a Slave?
Yes, and it's about, childbirth in the antebellum South. I studied plantation health and midwifery in the South. That's a really good book to read. Also, I think it's called, there's another book about midwifery in the South called Listen to Me Good, and it's a story of an Alabama midwife. And that's a really good book to read, just because like you were saying, it's all about power and everything. It's also about knowledge. And so back in the day, like midwifery has been a thing, especially in the South, for ages, you know what I mean? And it stopped in 1976 or so because they were getting too much power. You know what I mean? They had too much knowledge, they had too much agency in these medical spaces. And you were talking about Marion Sims and everything, and like how I guess going to a hospital and like midwifery, actually like the turn of the century happened, right? it's really interesting because a lot of the doctors that went to study childbirth and like gynecology and obstetrician and everything, they came from up here, and they went to plantations to learn from slaves, to learn how to birth these slaves, or birth children. And it's like, even at that time, most white women still trusted black, like, midwives, you know what I mean, to birth their babies, because doctors didn't know what they were doing. Like, they had to use black women to, like, take our knowledge. Then he, like, J. Marion Sims became, you know, it's interesting. So if you guys want to read that, those 2 books are really, really good to read.
And there were literal campaigns that tried to convince people not to trust these granny midwives, and ethnic European midwives as well, right? From parts of Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Spain, that they lived in parts of the US. They were dirty, they were backwards, they didn't practice hygienic, they didn't have hygienic practices, so much so that people started to distrust these midwives, and that gynecology became certified. Now you had to have certain certifications to prove that you were a bona fide gynecologist, and the experiential knowledge that was inherited from your grandmother or your great-grandmother, that wasn't enough, right? And still today, there's this whole, my class, transactional feminism, we read it last week or Monday, and we're supposed to discuss it about the racial disparity in midwifery among midwives in the US. It's something crazy, like 2 or 3% of midwives in the US are black, right? So even within this model of midwifery, we're still not being represented. Something also that I thought about is 2 things. That article in the New York Times, and also based on my research, there's this interesting statistics to say, let's say among Latinas or immigrants, immigrant women fare much better with maternity care or their maternal outcomes than Latinas that are US born and raised. So a Mexican woman that comes from Puebla, she came like 20 years ago or 10 years ago and had her formative years in Mexico and births here, she faces less exposure to obstetrics violence than a Mexican Latina who was born and raised in the US. And the theory is that it's just a prolonged exposure to racism. Another interesting thing is, you know, it's relatively recent in research. It's called the Latina paradox. Is this conundrum that I personally find myself in when I look at statistics, especially all these statistics that are coming up within Black Maternal Health Week, and it says Black women, Black women, Black women. I can't help but to wonder where Black Latinas fall within those statistics, because when they say Latinas, I envision who I already have a vision in my mind of who that is. It's a Sofia Vergara looking person. And that is a Latina. But a Latina is also a Mara la Negra. A Latina is also a phenotypically dark-skinned Dominican woman who she gets lost in the statistics because she's not deemed or labeled to be African American, but she doesn't have the same experiences as a lighter-skinned Latina because she's read as a Black woman as she is. So my interest in furthering my research stands in this Latina paradox. What happens when we look at what happens to Black Latinas? And my hunch is that we're going to fare just as worse as our African American counterparts because we're Black and we're raised as Black. And there's a lot of assumptions about who we are based on how we look. But right now, we either get lost in the Latina statistics or we don't exist within the Black statistics.
Can communities or families do for the younger generation where I am a doula, I have nieces and nephews, but their mothers are like, I want to be the first one to talk to them about sex. So what can like families and the community do to get that information out there where it's like they have that block where mom wants to be the first one, she wants to make sure the material is approved, but yet they need that education, that evidence-based education, that fertility awareness education. So what can be done for families and communities?
I mean, that's a really good question. I would say the bare like necessities in a sense is just have those conversations with the teens, the youth in your family, right? Just about like, what does birth look like? Or have you seen a baby being born? Or something as simple, not just children, but adults don't know that there are options to birthing a child. You can go to a birthing center, you could go to a hospital. But I would say that one of the things that I found on a community level that's informal are rites of passages, are community-based programs where they take young women and they walk them through like months or, a couple of months of workshops where you're exposing them to information about their menstrual cycle. You know how many, and we talk about this in my classes, you know how many grown women don't know how to track their cycle, don't recognize the power and the messages that are involved or that exist when you tap into like what I call your blood? There's a lot of misinformation and a lot of internalized hate with regards to menstruation. I talk about menstruation in classes and people are like, ugh, women included. So I think it's about demystifying. I think when we demystify menstruation, that's the root of that will unleash a form of empowerment that will allow the information to be digestible. And also, I mean, on like a policy level, create like a program to go into high schools and try to get funding for it. Just have rap sessions, one-on-ones, once a week for 2 hours, where young women, people that identify as women, can come in and just ask any question that they want without like a teacher or a parent watching over and them feeling like they're being judged.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. You touched on your experience of being a doula, but I just wanted to know what incentivized you to become one in the first place. Was it a specific event, or was it multiple events that made you think, oh, okay, well, that's it, like, I want to become a doula? And also, what advice do you have for someone who wants to become a doula? So what does the preparation process look like? What what are the steps that you take to become one?
Great question. I actually have a chapter published in a book called Black Women Birthing Justice. And it's just a collection of essays of different birth workers and people that have birthed babies in the context of exposing the injustices we just spoke about, but also telling new stories of empowerment. My trajectory, I think I dated back to when I was 8 years old and I saw my cousin in labor. My cousin was giving birth and nobody in the house spoke English, and they went next door to call me or my sister at 8 years old to speak to the ambulance. And when I walked into the room, I saw my cousin in labor, and I had never seen anybody look like that. She was squirming, she was making these sounds. The Latina, as a Dominican woman, we're in a machista culture. We are taught to like not take up space, and you have to be proper. And after you get your period, it's just like, no se la diga a nadie, and hay que comportarse, because like I say within patriarchy, for a lot of women, the only currency we have is our honor, right? So our honor is policed a lot as Latinas. So to see her, it kind of left this like imprint in my psyche. And then fast forward maybe 15 years later, I was taking a graduate level course, and a bunch of us were in the social sciences. This one woman was doing a research topic on how midwives were being pushed out of hospitals and the increased levels of C-sections and maternal mortality. And I was fascinated by it, like, what's a midwife and why do their presence matter so much? And then fast forward, I saw The Business of Being Born. Who's seen that? The Business of Being Born, wonderful. I mean, it has its issues, but wonderful documentary by Ricki Lake, she used to be a talk show host in the 90s. And I remember it was when Netflix was up and coming. I'm talking about like 2008. I had a Netflix account. My husband had it, and he kind of sent me the password when I was in Syracuse, and I was just like, and I don't know how I landed on The Business of Being Born. I wasn't looking, and I was boo-hooing. I was crying throughout the whole movie, and that did something to me. And the way I literally became a doula, I decided to train with Ancient Song, was actually during a very nasty split that my husband and I, fiance at the time, had. And I was really down and out. And I remember I was like laying on my bed with my laptop open, and I was scrolling through Facebook. And then I saw Ancient Song saying, we have an 8-week doula training. And I just emailed her. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't really know what a doula was. And the training, what it looks like, it depends. My training was 8 weeks every Saturday, and intensive. It was like from 9 to 4. And every session was something different, from the stages of birth to what happens in an emergency, to the resources that we can provide women if they need it, I had to read a lot. I had to read a lot of books. I had to write a bunch of book reports. I was like doing homework. And then you just train. People think, oh, you just train for 8 weeks. You train for 8 weeks. But then I had to have like something like 5 births in a matter of 6 months. So there's like hours that you have to provide, and then you get formally certified. The only like nationally recognized body that is respected for doulas is called DONA, Doulas of North America. And DONA exists, and gratefully so it does, but DONA is run mostly by white women, and they don't necessarily have the advocacy piece that birth justice advocates are really about. So if you talk to a lot of doulas of color, we're either not trained on the DONA, or we did DONA training and then we did other more, grassroots level of training. Ancient Song is a wonderful organization if anybody's interested. If you can do 8 Saturdays, they have like a weekend intensive where you do like Saturday and Sunday. Or you could like be really crunchy granola and go to like Mexico and sit with like the old curanderas, which some people have done, and really learn from them. Because that's where we have to go. We have to go to the viejas in our family. We have to go to the older women that are, eventually, slowly but surely dying, because they have the knowledge that we really need.
Speak. I don't know. I'm not picking anybody.
No, you should go.
Oh, okay. So first, thank you so much. I feel like my mind is going a mile a minute right now. One, because I'm not training, but I have an internship with CUNY this summer, so that's so exciting, and I'm training elsewhere. But a lot of the things you spoke about made me think of something. So I'm first gen. My family's from Haiti, and so I'm thinking about, as a doula or just as a birth worker, tapping into, like, there's a lot of themes about community, tapping into indigenous cultures. So whether that be Santeria or voodoo or an indigenous, religion from Mexico. I'm trying to navigate, how am I trying to ask this question? I'm just thinking about, like, have you incorporated that before within your work with women? Or do you feel like that's something that maybe as doulas we can probably take from that and incorporate into our work?
Oh, absolutely. I burn sage. I always carry Florida water. Unfortunately, my grandmother had 10 kids and they were all born at home because there weren't other options. But my grandmother passed away, so I don't have that level of knowledge. Right. But I do feel like there's just something instinctive about how I show up as a doula that just puts me in a space where like stuff just comes to me, like these downloads. A lot of people here know exactly what I'm talking about. Some people may be like, what? But it's just these like spiritual downloads that really put me, when I'm present, it requires presence, right? And being that we are the same people, it just requires you to be present and you will be spoken to. You will be spoken to, right? But like, for example, I incorporate like a lot of herbs. I have never done a formal herbology training. I'm looking forward to doing it, but things come to me. I'll be like, oh, she needs this. And a lot of times when I go online and I read it, it's like, oh, yeah, that is exactly what she may need, because either she's recovering from a C-section or she's a little bit nervous or anxious about the birth. So I think that it's obvious, like, about sitting with elders or going with like a trained professional to learn these modalities, but it's also a delicate balance between also knowing that you already embody those qualities. You just have to believe that you do. All of us here, we all have our unique knowledges that are untapped because we believe that the only knowledge we have is mental knowledge, and that we can't have that knowledge unless we go to school or unless we pay somebody that knows more than us to tell us that. But I'm all about like tap into the embodied knowledge and the information will come. Hi.
No, I'll go. No,
Okay, so being in a relationship with a doula,
Where's my husband?
I realized that it's very time consuming. On the phone all the time with a client all the time. You could be at a birth for an hour, which I realized this week, or it could be 2 days, which I've realized in the past. What do you do to balance your personal life? Because I know you may have another job or side hustles. What do you do to balance your personal life with like your husband and then also yourself to actually, decompress after a birth? Because you want your own space, your own time. But what do you do to kind of balance being a doula and the personal?
I love the question, right? It's all about self-care. I'm very big on self-care. Like, I will cancel plans quick for self-care. Immediately after a birth, I try not to come in straight to the house because birth energy is very intense. You have to remember, I just said, even if it ends up being a C-section, it's an exposure to an energy that we're not used to. And when there's a lot of like violence involved and it didn't pan out the way the person wanted, I'm extremely cautious or conscious of the fact that I'm carrying that, because we're also containers as doulas. So when I go home, I don't run to like my husband and my kid and like, shower them with all of that funk. Like, I usually just take my clothes off, usually put it in like, which ancient song doula services training taught me. You put it in a plastic bag because even your clothes carries the energy. As a doula, I often wrap my head when I'm in a birth because it's a whole lot. I often take a salt bath, just soak in a tub because, Epsom salt, but salt really helps anybody interested, anybody, a student, a doula. It helps clear like your aura or the multiple layers of your energy body that may be carrying stuff. Remember, we're like sponges. And if you're not conscious of it, when you ever been around like a person and you say, oh, that person just put me in a bad mood. It's true. It's true. Their aura is very maybe polluted, and if you're not like careful with guarding your aura, they just like dump stuff on you. So I take a salt bath, and also I don't take on as many births as I used to, and I'm also very selective. Unfortunately, I know that for our women in particular, women of color, I can't afford to be too selective, but I try to be as selective as possible. And the irony that I found is the higher paying clients are the ones that are really like they overburden. Well, in their mind, they're like, well, I'm paying this money. You are at like my beck and call 24/7. So I'm very careful with the clients that I take on. And end of the day, I remember that this is my labor of love. Like, if I get tired and there are moments where like, I don't know about the doulas here or those who have been at a birth. There are literal moments where I have been standing for like 20 hours and the little voice inside my head is like, how are we going to do this for like another 10? And I want to give up. But I remember that like I was sent here for this. I really feel, answering your question, I really feel that I was sent here for this. And all these things just played out in a way where, as you saw my very non-linear trajectory, I ended up becoming a doula. When if you would have told me at 25 that I was going to be a doula, I'd be like, what the fuck is a doula? But I was open and it happened.
What role does the insurances play in this entire conversation of female mortality when it comes to births? I know that most of the poor healthcare that these women get is implicit bias, but as someone that's done research around insurances and in particular emergency room overcrowding, it's all about emptying beds as quickly as possible because hospitals get reimbursed from insurances and Medicaid and Medicare. So I guess my question is, what role then does insurances play further in this conversation? And then also, is there any light at the end of the tunnel to kind of restructure the way that insurances play out in our healthcare system in general?
There was a bit of light. I don't know. I haven't really been following with the debacle with healthcare and Trump, but Obamacare gave the nation a little bit of hope to be like, okay, so for example, a pregnant woman under Obamacare, you can see a doctor as many times as you want. And that wasn't the case before, right? I don't know enough about like the specifics of, let's say, the history or the implications involved with different forms of insurance. But as of somebody that has been on the ground, I see the different level of care with somebody on Medicaid and somebody with private insurance. right? I see it. And, people that don't have insurance, the good thing is that New York offers you as a pregnant person and your unborn child insurance, but oftentimes it can take like 4 to 6 weeks to get the insurance. And those 4 to 6 weeks of the first few weeks of pregnancy are so delicate. So a lot of people go on without care during those first few weeks or months because of the red tape involved with Medicaid, or they'll just say, you can go to a doctor and pay out of pocket and then Medicaid will reimburse you. But like, most people here, I'm assuming, we don't have like $700 to drop to then, in a sense, be reimbursed. So I don't know where the Trump administration is going to take healthcare. If any other of the policies they've tried to enact is an indication, it doesn't seem to be getting any better. This is why it's such a dire thing more now than ever before to really empower doulas. However, I am still middle of the road with whether I'm very open to supporting doulas getting covered by insurance. Why? Because then the state gets involved a lot. And it's about, you need this certification and you need to do this. And there's a standardization that we know throughout history, especially as folks of color, immigrants, marginalized folks. When the state meddles too much into affairs, it's often not like the most beneficial thing. So it's again, the word that comes up for this phenomena of being a doula is like, it's a lot of conundrums. On one end, we want insurance to cover us because then we can offer our services full time and not have to worry about working other jobs. But on the other end, we don't want them to cover, the insurance companies to cover us, because then a lot of the doulas that have been practicing won't be able to practice.
I have a question. Cool. Speaking of like the viejitas and our embodied knowledge, for a long time, but like also while I've been doing this work, like I've been thinking about what is the legacy of like the witch burnings, but like also just like the patriarchal violence that has kind of like conditioned us to like be small and like not take up so much space and just like contract in a way, and like the way that I've seen like my mother and like my grandmother be brilliant, but like also be silenced. And I'm thinking about like the way that that history lives in our bodies and specifically in our wombs, and thinking about like that being activated within us now, and how completely unbelievable like my life is compared to just like one generation away. Yeah. So that's kind of like a long-winded way to ask. I feel like, like we're birthing liberation by like birthing ourselves and like tapping into that power. And I wonder if you could like speak more to that on a grander historical scale.
Yeah, I mean, that is a wonderful question, especially because my sister and I, we've developed this platform called Brujas of Brooklyn. We are identical twins who we're trying to recreate or like create a new narrative about who a witch is, right? Because we think of witch, we think of the Wizard of Oz, we think of evil, we think of spells, we think of this like ignorant old woman, is very ageist, is very immigrant woman who she relies on like her base instincts to move. And I'm like, yes, I want to be her, relying on your instincts to move. But and part of our platform is yoni power, right? Yoni is a Sanskrit word for vagina, womb, or sacred space. And we're all about reactivating that yoni power. How do we do that? Through yoga, through breathing. I'm lugging around this thing. It's like a bedpan because my sister and I are going to do a yoni steam for somebody tomorrow. What the hell is that? A bunch of herbs with different properties, and you steam your vagina. Yeah. But it's a very old, very ancient, but you could find the roots of it in Mayan culture. But it's, for those that are familiar with smudging, when you smudge, when you burn incense, and there's now like evidence, scientific evidence to prove that the smoke that the sage emits, it captures bacteria that leads to respiratory disorders or complications in the air. But the smoke, when you smudge like an incense, it's also supposed to act like a broom that sweeps out any of those bad vibes that we were talking about. With a yoni steam, you do that like on steroids, because you're sitting on this thing that emits steam into your vagina and your womb, because we believe that as women, as people with wombs, our wombs are not just about birthing babies. I'm not in line with the thinking that you're a woman if you have a baby. No. Why do we reframe the narrative about womb power? Because it's from our wombs that like we write papers. It's that creative power in our wombs that allows us to like dress ourselves to be unique beings. We use womb power to, I use womb power to create like this dialogue today. You use womb power to get out of like a fucked up relationship, right? You use womb power to like really develop and determine a perspective about yourself where you know, my students know, what's the first thing we read in class? Trans femme. The erotic. We read Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic, where she talks about it's that sensual aspect of ourselves that has been snuffed within capitalism. And sensuality is not just about having sex. That's a part of the continuum. But sensuality is about engaging your senses, hence sensuality. And it's about engaging all of your senses in all of you do. And my students always laugh, but I'm like, you should feel the same pleasure when you write a paper for my class than you do when you climax. And they're like, but it's that idea that sexuality is such a taboo thing that exists in this like little corner of our psyche. But when you allow that power, the Kundalini is primordial creative power, right? Everything in existence is created with sexual energy, but sexuality has been transformed into something that's debased, and it's heteronormative, it's a man and a woman, it's monogamous, and it only happens behind closed doors. So Audre Lorde and others push us to ask, what happens if we take that same intensity that manifests when we're having sex and it spills over into like our careers? And I always tell my students, most of your asses will not be sitting in my class. Not because I'm a boring professor, but because you know that you don't want to be sitting in a college classroom because you want to go and pursue your dreams. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, like, yes, womb power is very important to me and the work that I do as a doula. And I'm finding that more and more women are like coming to us like, I need this, I want this, because it's the disconnect within the witch trial legacy of that womb power that really allows women to unintentionally play really small. And there's nothing sadder for me in the world than seeing a woman like really play small. Anybody in the world, but a woman in particular, because we are the source of life. I know I upset some people now because, I know we're part of this very, necessary conversation about, troubling the waters of gender. But at the end of the day, you can't deny that like naturally it is a person with a womb that carries life. So why are we mistreating those people? Right? Yes.
So a week before the New York Times article on Black maternity rate came out, a week before that, the California Sunday magazine did like an expose on abortion providers, specifically focusing on private abortion providers across the country as like a national network. These are not registered; they're home abortion providers, and it's so striking to hear you talk about doula work, because a lot of these providers they're women who are not who are poor folk, who are not who are also outside of like the state system and can't often afford access to abortion within like a standardized clinic. And a lot of the work that they perform, like you said, they're on calls with women for months before, during, and after the abortion. They're also they're there. Often it's a 2-hour procedure. Often they're there for a week, right? And so it's the same, and it's so striking to hear you talk about it, because they're like different. And a lot of the women who are accessing their services are poor women who can't get care, but are also looking for that emotional environment, right, where their emotional health is also taken care of. So my question is, do you think there is a possibility for, I guess, these two movements who are almost like on different ends of like women's healthcare when it comes to birthing? Do you think there is space for them to work together in order to, like, you know, ultimately achieve and work towards the goal of providing women with an environment that that regards them as people?
I absolutely have faith that it's a possibility, but quite honestly, it takes white women to come to terms with the fact that racism is a real thing. Simple and not simple, right? Because, and I say white women in particular because that's the face of the subsequent waves of feminism in the US that have advocated for reproductive justice large scale, but there's still this idea that like, that it cannot be about race. You know, it's this, I don't know if it's a denial, I don't know if it's fear, I don't know if it's sadness, but there's still generally a denial or an inability to accept that bottom line, we live in a white supremacist country, and that your ability to live a fulfilled, empowered life is diminished because of the color of your skin and the baggage that's attached to you because of these markers. I don't mean to simplify it, but I really think that as women or people who are identified as women, maybe it's about having very honest conversations. And a lot of times, especially as a feminist, when I'm around, like, especially colleagues that are white, the gender always precedes race. And for me, I often recognize that that race supersedes all these other constructs. What do I mean? Statistically, myself as like a middle income professional woman with high degrees of education, I still fare worse than a white woman with a high school degree. That's a statistic that like I learned in that documentary, Death by Delivery. So how can we not see that it's about race? So I think that it's finally time for women, people that are interested in reversing this very atrocious patriarchal system, to sit and not hone in just on the fact that this is about gender, but at bottom line, this is about race. Like, I love this. Yesterday in my class, we read the Leith Mullings. She wrote this incredible piece on the Sojourner Syndrome about African-American women in Harlem. And she said this thing where she's like, race is not real, but racism has very real consequences. Very much so. And oftentimes when we talk about race, the clapback is like, but race is not real. And of course, I have to take deep breaths and be like, yes, race is not real. There's not a blood test that says, oh, this is an African-American person. This is a Caucasian person. But the reality of racism has very real consequences on a person's body. And we already know that because of the exhaustive amount of numbers that are coming out to show that a woman like me will still fare worse than like a white woman that has only a high school degree. And I remember when I was like 7 months pregnant, I was applying for a job at City College in the sociology department, and I give my job talk on birthing injustice, and I am like, I was very big, cute little belly, my cute little, kitty heels, still trying to look cute, and this was it was in a library filled with like my colleagues and people that I didn't know, and I'm on an interview, even though I had been working as an adjunct in the school for a few years, and I literally had to bite my tongue not to cry when I was showing the statistics about the fact that here I was, an embodiment of this statistic, to say that with a PhD, with high degrees of knowledge, with disposable income, I can still enter into a system where I will be experiencing birth in a way that's not as empowering as a white woman that has less education as me. And that's why my ass chose to stay at home. I consciously chose to birth at home because I'm like, I cannot put myself in a position where I'm going to have to be fighting to demand to be treated like a human being when I'm supposed to be like relaxing and going to like my happy place so that I can really birth this baby in peace. And those that know my child, they know that like, it's not because he's my baby, but I do see children that are birthed in a certain way. And there is something about children that didn't experience the violence in a hospital that I feel like you don't see that level of aggression in them that you do see in babies that were born in hospitals. Don't quote me, right? I haven't done the research. This is all embodied knowledge that I have, that I feel in my gut. But I do see that there's there's like an edge to babies that had to fight. My first birth I'm still a doula. It's like 4 weeks into my doula training. That year, it was 2012, I felt like every damn body in my family was having babies, which was great because I got to practice on them, right? My first birth, it was for the books from the Cuban doctor. I write about this in the chapter, calling me saying, if you keep antagonizing my staff, I will have your ass kicked out of that hospital room. To him saying, if you don't have a baby within an hour, we're gonna have a C-section because he had to go to his private practice. To the baby crowning and a nurse, literally, my little cousin's head was coming out like this. There was a nurse holding the baby's head like this for 10 minutes because the doctor was nowhere to be found and there was a resident. And the grandmas are like, what are you doing? And that's my husband's goddaughter. How's Anaya? How does she show up considering that you know that that's how she came to the world? She's feisty. She's feisty. And I think a lot of it has to do is because literally her head was coming out of her mother's vagina and there was a nurse pushing the baby's head in. How violent is that? How violent is that? My first birth, right? I can't make this up. And I'm sure that if we open up the space to the doulas here, they'll be like, girl, we have stories for days.
My friend's wife had almost the exact same experience in a hospital, yeah, for the exact same reason.
They try to push the baby in?
Because there was no actual doctor, it was just residents. And so they ultimately had to do a C-section.
Oh no, really?
Yeah. So they had to, apparently there was like a vacuum that they had to use.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Oh no.
On that note.
So all is not dire. There is hope. I'm here. There are other doulas of color. There are other white doulas in the room. There are birth workers who work tirelessly. Even though I focused a lot on race and racism, to me, this is a issue that affects humanity. Because if we believe that we are one, if one of us hurts, everybody hurts, right? I have a lot of faith that that Talib, he's 3 years old, when he chooses to have a child, that the person that's gonna have their child will have a much different experience in a hospital than a lot of women have. But unfortunately, it has taken a lot of women dying or almost dying for people to finally pay attention. One thing also that the birthing justice movement does as a framework is that we consider that birthing justice should be part of like something as essential as the Black Lives Matter movement. We are surprised as birth workers that within the Black Lives Matter, there isn't a conversation about birthing justice. Because yes, we're looking at gun violence in the hands of law enforcement, but that violence starts on that bed when that woman is pushing that black baby out of her vagina or it's being pulled from her stomach. Right? So until as a nation, but as a world, but as a nation in particular, we don't see birthing justice as a human right that we have to advocate for, we will continue to see women dying or almost dying or babies dying at these rates that are unacceptable. But I'm here and a lot of us are here in the trenches doing the work because we love it and because, I feel like our energies came from this very beautiful little planet and we were sent just to do this because you have to have guts to be a doula. You really do.
One more question?
I just want to add a small comment. Thank you so much for
Thank
this.
you.
You started with Erica Garner. So Erica was supposed to be our first speaker when we actually started this lecture series last semester. She was very pregnant. She couldn't come. She was supposed to come in October. She was very sick. And the fact that you started with that, and then again, it's always a pleasure to listen to incredibly smart women teach you things that you don't know. But the reason I wanted to say this is that all our lecture series is online, and one of the things that we do is also list all the books, the films, other things that are part of the conversation. So we'll have that up and running in a few weeks. I also know that you had some book suggestions, so we would like to have that as well. So if people, I know that a lot of you will have questions for Griselda, so please go and harass her after the conversation. But I'm here if you want to add more stuff. I can take it in and we will have all of it online so that, again, this becomes a resource and then this phenomenal talk has an afterlife beyond this to our
archiving, that is very important.
So if you have more book suggestions, we'll definitely make sure that everything that you mentioned goes into the part of our
and I'll
email.
send
If
it
you have
to you.
other books, I'm here. Please let me know, and then.
So it's gonna be online.
It's going to be online, so all the lectures are available on the Polis Project's website. There's a newsletter sign up there, so if you want more information, you can find our previous
Thank you all
lectures
for
online and
coming.
sign up for this as well.
Yeah, before you leave, if you could all
you're
join
not
me
done
and,
yet. You're not done yet,
we're not
sorry.
done yet.
So you can do the final.
Yeah,
concluding
I
remarks.
just wanted to, I also just wanted to thank you for
Thank
giving us
you,
all your
thank you.
time and all of you for your attendance, for your participation, for your insights. As Suchitra just said, we'll put as much of this stuff online as possible, continue the conversation. Don't forget to eat some food on your way out. Put your name on the sign-up sheet if you want to. And if you, again, can just join me in thanking Dr. Griselda Rodriguez.